A millionaire found a little girl digging in his garden. When he approached her, she unexpectedly replied, "I'm digging soil to bury my mother and brother." The garden had long been forgotten. The once manicured hedges had grown wild, curling like creeping fingers around the crumbling stone pathways. The fountain at the center, once a grand display of elegance, now lay dry and cracked, weeds sprouting through the marble fissures. The wind rustled through the unkempt branches, sending golden leaves tumbling down onto the overgrown grass, carrying the scent of earth, old, damp, and undisturbed for years. Robert Lancaster stood by the iron gate, gripping the cold metal as his eyes swept across the estate. It had been so long since he'd last stepped foot here. The weight of the past clung to the air like a heavy mist, thick with memories he wished would stay buried. He exhaled sharply, forcing the hesitation out of his chest. He had come to oversee the sale, to rid himself of the last fragment of a life he no longer belonged to. Yet, something about standing here again, this place where it all began and ended, made his pulse tighten. He started forward, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. But then, movement. A slight frantic motion caught his eye near the edge of the garden. His sharp gaze narrowed. A child. She was crouched near a patch of earth, her tiny hands clawing through the soil with determined urgency. Dirt smeared her arms up to the elbows, her knees pressed into the damp ground. Strands of unkempt hair stuck to her forehead, her cheeks smudged with dust and sweat. She didn't notice him at first, her head bent low, eyes fixed on the small hole she was creating. She was small, too small to be out here alone. Robert stepped closer, his shadow stretching long over her frail figure. "What the hell are you doing?" The girl froze mid-motion, fingers half buried in the dirt. Slowly, she tilted her head up, her gaze meeting his with an unsettling steadiness. Her eyes, dark and wide, held none of the startled fear he expected. Instead, there was something else, something too old for a child's face. "I'm taking this soil," she said, her voice calm, matter-of-fact. She wiped a dirty hand against her oversized sweater, leaving a streak of mud against the faded fabric. Robert's brows pulled together. "For what?" "To bury my mother and baby brother." Silence. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling dry leaves against the stone walls. Robert's breath stalled, his mind scrambling to make sense of what he'd just heard. There was no drama in her voice, no desperate plea for sympathy. She stated it as if it were the most logical thing in the world, as if she were explaining why she was tying her shoelaces or why the sky was blue. Something cold pressed against his spine. He took another step forward, studying her more closely now. She was painfully thin, her sweater hanging off her small frame like it had once belonged to someone much older. Her hands, raw and red from scraping at the soil, trembled slightly, but never fully stopped moving. "Your mother and brother." His voice was quieter now, more measured. "Are they—" "They're still alive," she interrupted. "For now." The words landed like a dull, heavy weight between them. "For now." Robert's jaw tightened. "Where are they?" Laura, he didn't know her name yet, but Laura seemed to suit her, studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the risk of answering. Then, finally, she lifted a small canvas bag beside her. The inside was lined with soil. "This is the best I can do." It hit him then. She wasn't just digging a hole. She was taking the soil with her, for graves she hadn't dug yet. Robert clenched his fists, trying to push down the unease settling in his stomach. He had no business getting involved. He should just turn away, pretend he hadn't seen anything, let the world take its course. But the longer he looked at her thin frame, the quiet determination in her eyes, the harder it was to leave. He exhaled through his nose, the decision already forming before he could stop himself. "Where do you live?" Laura didn't answer. Instead, she scooped another handful of dirt into the bag. Robert crouched beside her, ignoring the discomfort of his expensive suit against the damp ground. He leveled his gaze with hers. "I can help," he said, voice low. "But I need you to tell me where they are." Her hands stilled. For the first time since their encounter, something flickered in her expression. Uncertainty, hope, fear of hoping too much. She swallowed. Then finally, she said, "Not far." Robert rose to his feet, adjusting his cufflinks out of habit, before offering his hand. "Show me." Laura hesitated. Her small fingers curled around the fabric of her sweater, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then slowly, so painfully slowly, she reached out and took his hand. Her grip was small but firm. And with that, they walked away from the garden, away from the graves she had prepared, toward the ones she was still trying to prevent. The car hummed softly as it cut through the dimming landscape, the road stretching endlessly beneath the tires. Outside, the sky was deepening into a bruised shade of purple, the last streaks of daylight fading beneath the horizon. The headlights sliced through the encroaching dusk, illuminating patches of cracked pavement and the occasional skeletal remains of streetlights long since abandoned. Inside the car, silence thickened. Laura sat rigid in the passenger seat, small hands gripping the cloth bag in her lap, her nails pressing into the fabric as if letting go would mean losing the last bit of control she had. The weight of soil pressed against her thighs, familiar, grounding. Robert glanced sideways at her, at the way her small frame seemed to disappear beneath the oversized sweater she wore. The same sweater she had probably been wearing for days, its sleeves stretched from constant fidgeting. She stared straight ahead, her lips pressed together, her dark eyes unreadable in the dim interior light. He had seen this kind of silence before. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that was carefully constructed, built over time, layered with the unspoken understanding that words wouldn't change anything. Still, he needed to know. "What's your name?" His voice was steady, neither soft nor demanding, a beat of hesitation. Then she spoke, barely above a whisper. "Laura." Robert nodded, letting the name settle between them. "Laura," he repeated, testing the weight of it. "How old are you?" A pause. 9. 9. Too young to be digging graves, too young to be preparing for death like it was inevitable. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "And your mother?" Laura adjusted the bag on her lap, her knuckles whitening. "Anna." Robert didn't push. Instead, he let the quiet stretch, allowing her to fill it on her own terms. "My mom had my baby brother a few days ago," she said finally, her voice careful, measured. "She got sick after. At first she was just tired, then she got a fever, and then she stopped getting up." Robert felt something twist inside his chest. He kept his eyes on the road, but his fingers flexed against the wheel. "She tried to act okay," Laura continued, her voice tightening. "Said she just needed to rest. But I could tell she was lying. She was sweating even when it was cold. She wouldn't eat. She barely even held Lucas." Lucas. His jaw clenched. Robert had seen many things in his life: corporate betrayals, financial ruin, men who smiled in tailored suits while stabbing others in the back. But this, a child recounting her mother's decline with the kind of numb detachment usually reserved for people much older, this was something else. "She kept saying it would get better," Laura said, "that we just needed to wait." "And if it didn't?" Robert asked, his voice quieter now. Laura blinked slowly. "Then I'd bury them." The casual finality in her tone made something inside him recoil. She turned toward him then, her expression unreadable. "People like us don't get help." The words hung in the space between them, heavier than any accusation. Robert exhaled slowly. He didn't correct her, didn't say that wasn't true, because maybe for her it was. Instead, he reached for his phone. The dial tone barely rang twice before a clipped professional voice answered, "This is Lancaster." His tone shifted, cool and authoritative. "I need an ambulance dispatched to—" He glanced at Laura, wordlessly asking for directions. She hesitated before muttering an address. The operator confirmed the details. "We'll send a unit immediately." Robert ended the call and set the phone aside. Laura's grip on her bag tightened. "Why did you do that?" He flicked his gaze toward her, surprised by the sharpness in her tone. "Because waiting isn't an option," he said simply. She stared at him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his face. A trap, a condition, an ulterior motive. Finding nothing, she looked away, focusing on the blur of darkened streets outside the window. Robert didn't say anything else. He just drove. The shack sat at the end of a dirt path, barely standing against the wind. Its wooden planks were warped with age, some sections so frail they looked as though a strong gust might bring the entire structure down. A single, flickering candle glowed dimly through a broken window, its flame barely strong enough to hold back the darkness pressing in from all sides. Robert killed the engine and stepped out, his shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smelled of moss and rot, of something old and forgotten. Laura had already slipped out of the car before he could say anything. She moved quickly, barefoot over the cold ground, her small frame tense as she hurried toward the shack. "Laura," Robert called after her, but she didn't slow down. He followed, his longer strides catching up in seconds. When she reached the door, she hesitated, fingers hovering over the rusted handle, before finally pushing it open. The inside was worse than he expected. The space was cramped, just a single room with a sagging ceiling and a dirt floor. Piles of mismatched blankets were pushed against one corner, and an old wooden crate held a half-empty water jug and a dented tin can. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, illness, and something sharper, infection. And then, on the makeshift bed of blankets, he saw her. Anna. She lay motionless, her dark hair plastered to her forehead, her lips cracked and dry. Even in the dim light, Robert could see the unnatural pallor of her skin. She looked too still, too quiet, too close to the edge. Beside her, wrapped in a thin cloth, was the baby. Robert didn't hear a single cry. Laura stepped inside, positioning herself between him and her mother, her body going rigid like a guard dog ready to defend its territory. "Mum," she whispered, voice sharp with urgency. "Mum, wake up." No response. Robert felt something uncoil inside him, something cold, something old. This was what helplessness looked like, what it felt like. Anna stirred then, just barely, her eyelids fluttering weakly. Her breath came in shallow gasps. When her eyes opened, they weren't focused. Laura knelt beside her, reaching for her hand. "Mum, it's okay," she said, her small voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Anna turned her head slightly, her gaze sluggishly dragging toward Robert. She blinked, as if trying to make sense of him, then panic. Her fingers twitched, searching for something, and when she finally found the baby's fragile body, she clutched him to her chest with whatever strength she had left. "Don't take them," she rasped, her voice cracking with effort. "Please, don't." Robert took a step forward, hands raised slightly, not in surrender, but in reassurance. "I'm not here to take them," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "I called for help." Anna shook her head weakly. "No doctors. They'll take my kids." Her words were slurred, barely forming. Robert understood now. She wasn't just afraid of dying. She was afraid of being separated from them, afraid that if she let strangers take her to a hospital, someone would decide she was too unfit to keep her own children. Laura tightened her grip on her mother's wrist, her small body trembling. "It's okay, Mom. They're just going to help you. You have to let them help." Anna's lashes fluttered, her breathing growing more erratic. She was slipping. Robert turned to Laura. They're almost here. The sound of sirens swelled in the distance, the distant red and blue lights reflecting off the warped window pane. Stay with her, he said, moving toward the door. Laura didn't answer. She was too busy whispering reassurances into her mother's ear. The moment the ambulance pulled up, the paramedics wasted no time. 2 men in dark uniforms rushed forward with a stretcher, the back doors swinging open behind them. When they stepped inside, Laura snapped upright, instantly on edge. "She doesn't want to go," she blurted out. Robert placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Laura," he said carefully, "she doesn't have a choice." Her small fingers curled into fists, her whole body trembling with the force of something she didn't know how to contain. She was about to fight. But then, one of the paramedics crouched down to her level, a woman with kind eyes and a voice that didn't rush her. "You can come too," she said. "No one is taking her anywhere without you." Laura hesitated. Then, slowly, her fists loosened. When the paramedics carefully lifted Anna onto the stretcher, she let out a weak, pained sound. Laura flinched. Robert felt it. He looked down at her, at the way she clenched her jaw, at the way she was trying so hard not to break down. "Laura!" She turned, her dark eyes burning. "Get in the ambulance with them," he said. "I'll be right behind you." She didn't move at first. Then, with one last look at her mother's fragile form, she let go of the cloth bag. The sound of it hitting the floor was softer than expected, but deafening in its meaning. Without another word, she climbed into the ambulance, curling up beside her mother and baby brother. The doors shut. The sirens wailed. Robert exhaled sharply, then strode back to his car. He slid behind the wheel, but his hands weren't as steady as they should have been. He flexed them, adjusting his grip before pressing down on the gas. As the ambulance sped ahead, its flashing lights cutting through the darkness, he followed. Tighter than ever. Robert Lancaster was not a man who waited. He was the kind of person who made decisions quickly, who dictated the course of things rather than standing idly by while they unfolded. But hospitals had a way of stripping control from even the most powerful men. For days, he found himself returning to the sterile corridors of the ICU, a place that felt eerily familiar, though he wished it weren't. He had been here before, years ago, pacing outside a different room, waiting for news that had already been decided before he even arrived. He hadn't saved them then. Now, standing outside Anna's hospital room, he wasn't sure if he was trying to save her, or if he was trying to save himself. Laura sat on the hospital chair beside him, her small hands resting on her lap, picking at the frayed edges of her sweater. She hadn't asked him why he kept coming back. She hadn't spoken much at all. But every time he arrived, she looked at him like she had been expecting him. Robert never asked why that unsettled him. When the doctor finally cleared his throat, it was Anna he addressed. She was sitting up now, a small but significant improvement from the limp figure they had rushed in days ago. Her dark hair was tangled, her face still pale, but there was color beneath her skin now, a whisper of life trying to reclaim her. "You're stable," the doctor said, flipping through her chart. "The infection is responding to treatment. You still need rest, and you'll be weak for a while, but with care and proper nutrition, you should recover fully." Anna nodded, but her fingers twisted in the hospital blanket. "And Lucas?" "The baby is still under observation," the doctor admitted. "He's weak, but he's fighting." Robert watched as her shoulders sagged, relief flooding her posture. Her fingers unclenched, her lips parting slightly, as if she had been holding her breath for days and could finally exhale. Laura, standing at the foot of the bed, didn't move. She stared at her mother, her expression unreadable, her hands curled into fists. Then, suddenly, she turned on her heel and walked to the window. Robert followed her with his gaze. The weight of everything she had carried, alone, at 9 years old, wasn't something that disappeared overnight. "She was ready to bury you," he said softly, his voice just for Anna. Her head snapped toward him, her brows pulling together. He didn't say it to hurt her. It wasn't an accusation in his tone, but a fact. A brutal, undeniable reality. Anna swallowed hard, her fingers trembling where they rested on the sheets. Her daughter had been ready for the worst, because in her world, that was the only outcome people like them were given. Tears welled in Anna's eyes before she could stop them. She pressed her palm to her mouth, shoulders shaking, but no sound came. She had spent too long being strong, too long holding it in. Robert, unprepared for raw emotion, grabbed the tissue box beside her bed and shoved it toward her. "Here." Anna let out a watery, humorless laugh, swiping at her eyes. "Thanks." Robert cleared his throat and took a step back, stuffing his hands in his pockets. Emotion made him uncomfortable. It always had. Maybe that was why the next words left his mouth before he could think them through. "You should come stay at my house." Silence. Laura turned back from the window. Anna's red-rimmed eyes blinked at him in confusion, as if she wasn't sure she had heard him right. "What?" Robert shifted his weight, suddenly regretting his decision to speak. "You need time to recover. That shack isn't livable, and the baby," he exhaled sharply, "he'll need care, more than you can provide alone." Anna's lips parted slightly, shock flickering across her features. Robert could already see her instinctual refusal forming. He wasn't sure why he cared, but he did. So before she could reject the idea, Laura spoke first. "Why?" Robert turned to her. She was studying him, her dark eyes sharper than they should have been for someone so young. Not hopeful, not relieved, just searching. She had learned not to trust generosity. She had learned that people always wanted something. Robert met her gaze evenly. "Because I can. And I'm alone. Don't worry about convenience or anyone else." Laura didn't react immediately. She just watched him, silent, calculating. Then, ever so slightly, her expression shifted. She saw something in him, something he wasn't sure was even there. Finally, she turned to her mother. "Mom." Anna inhaled shakily. "I don't know. Where else would we go?" The question wasn't meant to be cruel, but it was. Because it was true. Anna looked down at her hands, the exhaustion settling in again. She had fought for so long. Maybe, just this once, she didn't have to. Her shoulders slumped. Then finally, softly, she nodded. Robert didn't let himself acknowledge the relief he felt. He just grabbed his phone and made the necessary arrangements. The Lancaster estate was everything Anna expected it to be. Grand, pristine, lifeless. The driveway stretched long and winding, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, the kind only the meticulous hands of hired gardeners could maintain. The mansion itself loomed against the sky, its vast windows reflecting the golden glow of the setting sun. But there was no warmth in it, no trace of laughter or love. It was just a house, a hollow thing made of expensive walls and empty rooms. Anna hesitated at the entrance, shifting her weight as she cradled Lucas. He was sleeping now, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily. The hospital had released them with strict instructions, but Anna knew no amount of medical guidance could change what had already been set in motion. They were starting over, in a world that didn't belong to them. Laura, however, didn't hesitate. The moment the doors opened, she stepped inside, her dark eyes flickering across the high ceilings and the marble floors. She wasn't impressed. She wasn't awed. She was simply watching. Robert stood a few steps behind them, hands in his pockets, as if he was waiting for someone to say something first. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Anna shifted Lucas against her chest. "We can't stay long," she murmured. "Just until I'm back on my feet." Robert's gaze flicked toward her. "I didn't put a time limit on it." Anna nodded, but her grip on the baby tightened. She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. Laura wandered further into the house, her steps cautious but not fearful. There was something eerily self-assured about the way she carried herself, like she had already mapped the escape routes, already decided how she would exist here without fully belonging. And then, without warning, Lucas let out a small, sleepy whimper. Robert barely noticed at first, until Laura turned back, her expression slightly unreadable. She watched as Lucas stirred in his mother's arms, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling against her sweater. Then, slowly, he opened his eyes. And the first thing he reached for was Robert. The billionaire stiffened, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. The baby wasn't crying. He wasn't afraid. He just reached. His small, unsteady hand stretched toward him, grasping at the air, tiny fingers twitching, searching for something. Robert swallowed hard. He didn't move. Anna, noticing, shifted uncomfortably. "He's just adjusting," she said quickly, like she had to explain it away. But Laura tilted her head, her gaze flicking between the two of them. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. Days passed, and Laura adapted. She didn't fidget when she ate at the long, polished dining table. She didn't get lost in the endless hallways. She didn't seem overwhelmed by the sheer size of the estate. She just absorbed everything. Anna, on the other hand, struggled. She spent most of her time in the guest room, hovering over Lucas, keeping to herself. She didn't touch the expensive furniture, didn't take up space. Robert knew she was counting the days until she could leave. But Laura was different. One evening, long after the house had settled into quiet, Robert caught a slight creak down the hall. It was subtle, barely a sound, but he had lived alone long enough to notice when something shifted in his space. He followed the noise, his steps slow, measured, and then he saw it. The study door, open. His heart clenched. Laura stood inside, her small frame illuminated by the dim lamp glow, fingers hovering over an old wooden desk. But it wasn't the desk she was focused on. It was the photo. A framed picture, tucked near the back of the shelves, covered in a thin layer of dust. Forgotten, buried, untouched. A woman with warm eyes, a little girl with Robert's nose, smiling, alive, before. Laura turned, holding the frame in both hands. She didn't flinch when she saw Robert standing there. She simply looked up at him and asked, "Who were they?" His pulse tightened. For a long moment he didn't answer. The study wasn't for visitors. No one went in here, not the staff, not even him. But Laura had. Robert exhaled through his nose. His voice, when it finally came, was low, strained. "My wife and daughter." The silence after was suffocating. Laura didn't react the way people usually did. She didn't gasp. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't tiptoe around it like it was something fragile. Instead, she just looked at the picture again. Then she said, "At least you got to love them before they left." Robert stilled. The words shouldn't have hurt. They weren't meant to be cruel. But they did. And maybe they were. Because they were true. She placed the frame back gently, then turned toward the door. And as she passed him, she whispered, "Good night, Robert." He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the faces in the photo, feeling like he was seeing them for the first time. The morning was normal. That should have been Robert's first warning. Anna had mentioned needing a few things for Lucas: diapers, formula, new clothes that actually fit him. Robert had offered to send one of his drivers, but Anna, stiff-backed and stubborn, had refused. "I can handle a trip to the mall, Robert. I'm not dying anymore." So she went, and Laura went with her. Robert didn't question it. He should have. The call came late that evening. Robert was in his office, reviewing reports he wasn't really reading. He had been on edge all day, though he couldn't explain why. Some part of him was waiting for something to go wrong. Then his phone rang, and everything stopped. "This is Lancaster." The voice on the other end was rushed, urgent. "Sir, there's been an accident." Robert's breath caught. His grip on the phone tightened. "Where?" "A vehicle collision near the downtown shopping district. The victims—" The dispatcher hesitated, then continued. "It's Anna Carter and Laura Carter." The words slammed into him, hard and unforgiving. Robert was already moving before the dispatcher finished speaking. His chair scraped against the hardwood. He grabbed his coat with shaking hands, ignoring the way his vision blurred for a second. Not again. Not again. The drive to the hospital was a blur. His hands clenched the wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. His breath came in uneven bursts. Flashes of the past. The police call. The sterile rooms. The way his wife's hand had gone limp in his. Burned behind his eyes. He had lost them that night. He could not lose them again. Leave a comment, grilled corn, if you are praying for peace for Anna and Laura. By the time he pulled up to the hospital, his heart was slamming against his ribs. He barely put the car in park before shoving the door open. Inside, the emergency room was chaos. Bright lights, fast-moving nurses, voices overlapping in urgent tones. The smell of antiseptic and blood hit him like a physical thing. He forced himself to the front desk. "Anna Carter and Laura Carter," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Where are they?" The nurse looked up, startled. "Are you family?" The question made something inside him snap. "Tell me where they are." The nurse hesitated for only a second, before nodding toward the hallway. "Anna Carter is stable. Mild concussion, some bruising. She's conscious." Robert exhaled, unsteady, but it wasn't enough. "And the girl?" The nurse's face changed. Robert felt the shift before she even spoke. "She's in critical care," the nurse admitted. "Severe head trauma. She's in surgery now." Robert's breath stopped. The ground beneath him tilted. He didn't realize he was shaking until he clenched his fists, forcing himself back into control. "Where is the baby?" His voice was tight. The nurse glanced behind him, toward a waiting room. "With one of our staff members. He wasn't injured, just shaken." Robert turned, and there he was. Lucas. The baby sat in a hospital-issued onesie, small and fragile in the too-big chair. His tiny fingers curled and uncurled, his dark eyes darting around the room, searching for something. For someone. Robert barely thought before moving. He crossed the room in a few strides. Then, without hesitation, he picked Lucas up. The baby didn't cry. He just clung to him, tiny fingers gripping Robert's shirt, holding on like he knew, like he could feel the panic coiling in Robert's chest. Robert sat down, his arms instinctively curling around Lucas's small frame. His hands were still trembling. This isn't happening. Not again. The next few hours were endless. Robert paced the hallway outside Laura's surgery room. The doctors had given him only the necessary information. Skull fracture, internal swelling. She had been unconscious since the accident. It wasn't good. Anna, still weak from her own injuries, had been wheeled to a different room. She had fought against the doctors at first, demanding to see Laura, but they had sedated her before she could do more damage. Now, it was just him. Him and the waiting. Lucas had fallen asleep against his chest, his tiny breaths warm against Robert's collar. Robert barely moved, the past and present blurred. It was the same room, the same unbearable silence. Years ago, he had sat in this exact kind of chair, waiting for news he already knew would be bad. He couldn't do it again. The door to the surgery ward opened. Robert stood immediately. A doctor stepped out, tired but composed. His scrubs were clean, a good sign. Robert's throat was tight. "How is she?" The doctor exhaled. "She made it through surgery." The weight of those words crashed into him so hard, he nearly sat back down. There was swelling. But we were able to relieve the pressure, the doctor continued. She's stable, but unconscious. We won't know about brain function until she wakes up. If she wakes up, Robert heard the unspoken words loud and clear. She's young, the doctor added, gentler now. That's in her favor. But we'll need to monitor her closely. Robert nodded, once, sharply. Can I see her? The doctor hesitated. Then he nodded. The room was quiet. Laura lay small and still in the hospital bed, her face pale against the white sheets. Too pale. The bandage wrapped around her forehead seemed too big, too foreign on someone so full of life just hours ago. Robert stood at the foot of the bed, his chest aching in a way he hadn't let himself feel in years. She shouldn't be here. She should be complaining about his house being too quiet. She should be challenging him with those dark, knowing eyes. She should be moving. Lucas stirred in his arms. Robert looked down at the tiny boy who had no idea what had happened. And for the first time in a long, long time. Robert closed his eyes and prayed. The hospital room was too quiet. The only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of the machines, the faint hum of the ventilation system, and the occasional rustling of the blankets as Robert adjusted in his chair. Laura lay in the bed, still, pale, unmoving. The bandages wrapped around her head made her seem even smaller than she already was. Her chest rose and fell in slow, even breaths, but there was no sign of her waking. Robert hadn't left since she came out of surgery. The doctors told him there was nothing more to do but wait. He hated waiting. His fingers tapped against the armrest of the chair, his jaw tight. He could feel exhaustion weighing on his body, pressing behind his eyes, dragging at his limbs. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw another hospital bed, another child that never woke up. So he stayed awake. Anna had woken up once, earlier that morning. Robert had been sitting exactly where he was now, Lucas curled in his arms, when the door creaked open. She was pale, moving carefully, one arm wrapped around her ribs, where she had been bruised in the crash. But she didn't look at Robert. Her gaze went straight to Laura. She let out a breath, soft, shaky, almost soundless. Then she whispered, "How long?" Robert knew what she meant. Since the surgery ended. His voice was lower than usual, rough around the edges. Anna swallowed, stepping closer to the bed. She reached out, brushing a few strands of hair away from Laura's face. Her fingers trembled. "She was talking to me," Anna murmured, "before the accident, about..." Her voice cracked. "She was telling me about the house, about Lucas reaching for you." Robert stilled. Anna turned to him then, her eyes unreadable. "You really haven't left?" Robert didn't answer. She shook her head, letting out a quiet, breathless laugh. "She's gotten to you, hasn't she?" That time, he didn't have an answer. Night fell. Lucas, small and warm against Robert's chest, had drifted to sleep long ago, his tiny breaths even and soft. The nurses had suggested more than once that Robert go home. He didn't. Instead, he picked up a book from the bedside table, the one Laura had brought back from the estate weeks ago before she had gotten hurt. She had left it there, just beside the lamp, never putting it away, always intending to come back to it. Robert opened it, and he started reading. His voice was quiet, low. He didn't rush the words, didn't skip over details. It had been years since he had read like this, since he had spoken to someone who wasn't awake to listen. But he kept reading, because if he stopped, he would have to think about the silence, and he couldn't bear that. Anna watched from the doorway. She had come to check on Laura, but the sight in front of her stopped her cold. Robert, cold, distant, unreachable Robert, reading softly to an unconscious child. Lucas, nestled against him, shifted slightly in his sleep. The image burned itself into her mind. She knew Robert Lancaster was not the kind of man people leaned on, but Laura had. and so had Lucas. Anna stepped back before Robert noticed she was there. For the first time since she had met him, she wasn't sure what she thought about him anymore. Sometime past midnight, Lucas stirred. Robert, half awake, shifted slightly, adjusting his hold. Then, in a sleepy, drowsy little voice, Lucas mumbled something against his shirt. "Pa, Pa." Robert went rigid. He must have misheard. Lucas let out a small sigh, curling deeper into his arms. "Pa, Pa," he whispered again. Robert didn't correct him. For the first time in his life, he didn't. The morning light seeped through the hospital blinds, casting golden streaks across the walls. It should have felt warm, a signal of a new day, of hope. But to Robert, it was just another reminder of how much time had passed with nothing changing. Laura lay still in the hospital bed, her breathing steady but shallow. The machines beeped in slow, measured intervals, each sound punctuating the heavy silence that had settled over the room. The bandages around her head made her look smaller than she already was. Too fragile. Too still. Robert sat beside her, his posture rigid, the exhaustion in his bones pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. A book lay open in his lap, the same one he had been reading for days. His voice, rough and low, filled the empty space between them. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but he kept reading anyway, because if he stopped, the silence would swallow him whole. Lucas stirred in his arms, his tiny fingers grasping at the fabric of Robert's shirt. The baby had barely left his side since the accident, his small body instinctively curling into the warmth of someone familiar. Robert glanced down at him, his grip tightening ever so slightly. He was getting used to this. He shouldn't be. A deep sigh escaped him, and he closed the book, rubbing a hand over his tired face. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. He had told himself, from the moment he let them into his house, that he wouldn't get attached, that he wouldn't care, that they were just temporary. But now he sat here, night after night, refusing to leave, waiting, praying, something he hadn't done in years. He leaned back in his chair, letting his head rest against the stiff cushions. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, his body aching from too many hours in the same position. He let his eyes slip shut, just for a moment, and then a sound, software hoarse, barely there. Robert's eyes snapped open. At first he thought he imagined it, but then a tiny, breathless whisper. "Dad." Robert went completely still. His pulse stopped, then roared to life. His entire body locked in place, his breath caught in his throat. He didn't move. Had he misheard? Had exhaustion finally made him start hearing things? But then Laura stirred, barely. Her eyelashes fluttered, her small fingers twitching beneath the hospital blanket. She looked weak, unfocused, but she was awake. And she was looking at him. His heart slammed against his ribs. For a split second, he couldn't breathe. Then, everything inside him cracked. Robert lurched forward, gripping the edges of the hospital bed as if to ground himself. "Laura," he rasped, his voice rough, unsteady. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes struggling to stay open. She was fighting it, fighting to stay in the moment, to hold on. She swallowed weakly. And then, "Dad." This time the word was softer, barely more than air. But it was real, and it broke him. A sharp breath escaped him, and without thinking, without hesitating, he gathered her in his arms. Carefully, desperately, he lifted her from the bed, his arms curling around her small frame. His forehead pressed against her temple, his fingers trembling as they held her close. And for the first time in years, Robert Lancaster broke. His chest shook, his vision blurred, his grip on her tightened, as if letting go meant losing her all over again. He hadn't cried in so long he had almost forgotten how, but now he couldn't stop. Tears slipped down his face, silent and unrelenting. Laura, still barely conscious, let out a small, sleepy sigh against his shoulder. "Daddy, can you be my daddy? Once time," she whispered again. And Robert held her tighter, his body curling protectively around hers, his entire being shattering and rebuilding in the same breath. He didn't say anything, didn't tell her she was wrong, didn't tell her she had mistaken him for someone else. Because the truth, the terrifying, undeniable truth, was that he didn't want to correct her. Not now. Not ever. 4 months had passed. The season had changed, warm spring air giving way to the lazy heat of early summer. The estate, once cold and hollow, had slowly begun to feel less like a monument to grief and more like a home. Laura had recovered fully. Her head still bore a faint scar beneath her hairline, a reminder of the accident, but she had returned to her usual self, sharp-eyed, observant, and too stubborn for her own good. Lucas, now stronger, no longer reached for Robert with hesitance, but with certainty, and Anna, her body healed, had finally done what she had been threatening to do for weeks. She found a way to stand on her own. Robert watched all of it happen, letting time move forward, letting things shift and settle in a way he hadn't expected. And yet, he still wasn't sure where he fit in it all. The estate no longer felt as empty as it once did. From his study, Robert could hear faint sounds from the other side of the house. The low hum of Anna in the kitchen, the quiet shuffle of Laura's feet as she moved through the halls. And Lucas, always Lucas, babbling nonsense in a voice that had somehow become the most familiar sound in the world to him. Anna had insisted on leaving. Despite Robert's repeated attempts to convince her otherwise, she had refused to be kept, had refused to be someone who simply occupied space in a house that wasn't hers. And so, she had taken a job as his housekeeper, keeping things running with a quiet efficiency that rivaled any staff he had hired before. "It's not about the money," she had told him when he protested. "It's about dignity." And in the end, he had let her win. But she wouldn't allow Robert to adopt her children. She wanted to earn her own money and raise them. Even if Robert was kind, it would be out of love, not out of legal obligation. She always had that determined fire in her eyes, the kind that refused pity, refused charity. He had never been the kind of man to argue with someone who knew their own mind. Laura too had settled in ways that unnerved him. She had carved out spaces in his home that belonged to her now. The library, where she would sit on the floor, thumbing through books she didn't always finish. The back garden, where she would sit in the grass with Lucas, making up stories for him in hushed tones. And the dining table, his dining table, where she always managed to sit across from him, watching. She never called him Robert anymore, but she also never called him Dad again. Not since that night in the hospital. And he didn't know if that should make him relieved or disappointed. One evening, the air warm and thick with the scent of summer, Laura appeared in the doorway of his study. Robert barely looked up from his work. "It's late," he said, flipping through the papers in front of him. Laura didn't move. "Papa." Robert stilled. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the sound of that word until now. He finally looked up, and there she stood, small, barefoot, arms crossed over her chest. But there was no demand in her voice, no challenge in her posture, just expectation. "Come play," she said simply. Robert blinked at her. "Play?" Laura nodded. "Lucas and I are outside. You should come." Robert let out a slow breath, glancing back at the paperwork on his desk. There were contracts to sign, reports to review, things that required his attention. And yet, he hesitated. Laura raised a brow. "What, you forgot how?" Robert narrowed his eyes slightly, but there was no real heat behind it. Laura just shrugged. "It's okay if you did. I can teach you." The corner of Robert's mouth twitched, and before he could think too much about it, he stood. Laura didn't wait for him to change his mind. She grabbed his hand, tugging him out of the study, leading him through the hall and out onto the wide expanse of green behind the estate. Lucas sat in the grass, a small toy clutched in his chubby hands, babbling nonsense to himself. The sun had nearly set, the sky turning soft shades of orange and pink, the world slipping into quiet. Robert exhaled. It felt different out here, lighter, easier. Laura plopped down next to Lucas, patting the space beside her. "Sit." Robert gave her a look. "I don't." "Sit." With a dramatic sigh, he lowered himself onto the grass. Laura grinned, satisfied. And then, before he could even process it, Lucas crawled into his lap. Robert froze. Lucas settled comfortably, small fingers grabbing at Robert's sleeve like he belonged there, like it was natural. Robert swallowed hard, looking down at the child in his arms. It shouldn't have felt this right. Laura watched him closely, as if studying his reaction. Then, in a voice softer than before, she asked, "Do you still miss them?" Robert didn't need to ask who she meant. He nodded once. "Yeah." Laura considered that. Then, she leaned back on her elbows, looking up at the sky. "I think they'd be happy," she said after a while, "that you have us now." Robert stared at her. He didn't know what to say to that. So, for the first time in years, he did something he thought he had forgotten how to do. He laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was just real. Laura grinned. "See? Told you I could teach you." Robert shook his head, but he didn't argue. Because for the first time in so damn long, the future didn't feel empty anymore. The days stretched long and warm, summer settling over the estate like a quiet promise. The once empty halls now carried the soft echoes of footsteps, laughter, and life. Laura and Lucas belonged here now. Anna, ever practical, still resisted calling it home. She had insisted, over and over, that she didn't want to be a guest, a charity case. She had refused his offer of adoption, but she had accepted something else, the choice to stay. She had taken over the role of housekeeper, though Robert knew it wasn't about the money. It was about control, dignity, and independence. She cooked, cleaned, and managed the house with quiet efficiency. But more than that, she waited. Every evening, after Robert returned from his office, she was there, not standing stiffly like a servant, but sitting on the patio, Lucas in her lap, Laura beside her, waiting for him to come home. And that, more than anything, had become the new routine. That evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, they gathered outside, the air thick with the scent of grass and warm earth. Laura lay stretched out on the grass beside Lucas, the baby cooing as he tugged at her sleeve. Anna sat nearby, one leg tucked under the other, watching them with a soft, unreadable expression. Robert stood on the patio steps, taking in the sight before him. His house, his land, but not just his anymore. "You're staring," Laura remarked, tilting her head up at him. Robert raised an eyebrow. "And?" She smirked. "Creepy." Anna let out a quiet laugh. Lucas, taking it as encouragement, clapped his hands and babbled nonsense to no one in particular. Robert sighed, stepping down onto the grass. "You called me out here, didn't you?" "Yeah." Laura sat up, brushing off her shirt. "Figured you'd want to actually enjoy this place instead of just existing in it." Robert hummed, glancing around. She wasn't wrong. He had built this estate as a refuge, a place to be alone. But now, he wasn't alone. The sunset blared across the horizon, the colors deepening, the night creeping in slowly. Robert sat down on the grass beside them, his legs stretched out, his back stiff at first, but gradually easing. Laura leaned back on her hands, looking up at the sky. "Have you ever planted anything here?" Robert glanced at her. "No." She made a face. "Not even a tree?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. didn't see the point. Silence. Then Laura shifted closer. She hesitated for only a second before sliding her small hand into his. Robert stilled. Her fingers curled lightly around his, warm, familiar, trusting. Anna didn't say anything, but when he glanced at her, she was watching with something soft in her eyes. Lucas, oblivious to the moment, giggled and reached for Robert's sleeve. And Robert let them. He let himself stay. He let himself breathe. Finally, after a long moment, he whispered, "Thank you for giving me the land." Laura blinked up at him. "What?" Robert exhaled slowly, glancing out at the garden, at the space that no longer felt empty. "This time I will plant trees. We can hope." He paused. His voice dropped, quieter now. "And this time, I will not fail." Laura said nothing. She just squeezed his hand. Anna's shoulders softened, her gaze lowering to the ground. Lucas, still babbling, curled against Robert's side, warm and content. The past would always be with him. But for the first time, he wasn't running from it. This time, he chose to stay. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.